En el nombre de Equilibrio Global tengo el agrado de compartir con ustedes un nuevo video en nuestro canal YouTube. En esta oportunidad nos trasladaremos virtualmente a Tbilisi, capital de Georgia, en el Cáucaso. Y vamos a conocer la voz de un referente del país, que nos ayudará a comprender la posición georgiana frente al conflicto que sostienen sus vecinos Armenia y Azerbaiyán. Hoy les presentamos a Viktor Kipiani, presidente del think tank GEOCASE. Al momento de estar grabando este video, diciembre de 2020, hay mucho que analizar sobre la segunda guerra de Nagorno Karabaj. Hemos oído la postura de diversos estados sobre el conflicto, como por ejemplo Turquía, Francia o Rusia, pero muy poco, prácticamente nada, hemos sabido de la postura de Georgia, estado que comparte fronteras con ambos beligerantes. Pero antes de conocer estas calificadas reflexiones, los invito a suscribirse a nuestro canal YouTube, haciendo clic en el botón que está aquí debajo. Es un sencillo gesto de adhesión que desde nuestra organización valoramos mucho. El video de hoy consta de 4 ejes. La posición de Georgia durante la segunda guerra de Nagorno Karabaj, que representa el acuerdo tripartito entre Armenia, Azerbaiyán y la Federación Rusa. ¿Qué escenario a futuro puede imaginarse con la presencia de los peacekeepers rusos en la región? Y finalmente el prisma georgiano ante el nuevo escenario regional. Viktor Kipiani es presidente del think tank GEOCASE de Georgia. Es analista internacional, columnista en medios locales y europeos, docente y conferencista. Lidera un equipo independiente de expertos que asesoran a grandes compañías y al sector público en temas de energía, finanzas y geopolítica. Es socio principal y cofundador del estudio de abogados MKD, con sede en Tbilisi. Además, Viktor Kipiani es autor de diversos artículos y encuestas sobre el sistema jurídico georgiano. Adicionalmente, es miembro del Colegio de Abogados de Georgia y fundador del Instituto Georgiano de Reformas Civiles y Económicas.
It's my pleasure to share some of my views or impressions or thoughts with Equilibrium Global on the recent situation in the Caucasus. Let's start with some overview of the recent flare-up of the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which led to the ceasefire agreement concluded on the November 10th. Georgia's stance and Georgia's attitude to the conflict has been suggesting a peaceful initiative, the conflict, inviting the conflicting parties to Tbilisi and providing with any assistance, any help to broker a ceasefire. That was the statement clearly made by the Prime Minister of Georgia at that time when the conflict has erupted. On top of this, of that initiative, Georgia has suggested to provide with any help or assistance to bring Armenia and Azerbaijan to the table of negotiations. Besides, what is not less important, that Georgia's National Security Council suspended shipments both to Azerbaijan and Armenia, except of civil cargo. That was done for the purposes of avoiding any frictions or any conflict of interest and keeping our neutrality as much as possible. That clearly, that suspension has caused a number of suspicions, doubts, and speculations. There was also some dissatisfaction by the conflicting parties, but that was the only right stance which Georgia could adopt at that point in the nature of our good neighborhood policy with both the countries, and as a gesture of our peaceful initiatives region-wide and in our with regard to our close neighborhood. So that is very, very important, and we still keep that line of approach. We should also not forget that we have two very large ethnic minorities in Georgia, which are Azeris and Armenians. And that was clearly an initiative, that was clearly an extra incentive for this country to keep out of any mess, out of any any frictions. But we were also realizing that the longer this conflict could last, more difficult and more harder would be for Georgia to keep a neutrality. And eventually, regardless of previous number of previous attempts to mediate and broker a ceasefire, eventually that ceasefire agreement was signed on November 10th, which also created a sort of a different geopolitical situation in the region. Few points which I would like to raise in connection with that new realities on the ground are that the Russians have substantially increased their military presence in the region, and in addition to Armenia, where they keep a military base, and in addition to the so-called peacekeepers in the past and now actually the effectively occupying Georgia's breakaway provinces. When speaking about the ceasefire agreement, I would like to emphasize that this is a ceasefire agreement, this is not a peace agreement, and that's something very important to remember, because there are the wrong connotations when in various sources the agreement from the 10th of November is called the peace agreement, but effectively it's not the peace agreement. It's a ceasefire agreement. Provides for a number of provisions which raise concerns, which raise certain suspicions, and which raise, quite far-reaching questions. One of those issues, which from the Georgian perspective is of particular concern, is an article number 9 of the ceasefire agreement, which speaks about the transport corridor from Azerbaijan proper through Armenia and to Nakhichevan Autonomous Oblast, which also belongs to Azerbaijan, and which neighbors with Turkey. That is probably something which has to be explored, later on in more details, how that limits Georgian transit corridor. Would that have any impacts on Georgian transport potentials and transport hub? That is one point. Also, there are various points which relates to return of refugees or internal displaced people to Nagorno-Karabakh, something which the parties have to work out in more details. It's also the coexistence of Turkish military observers alongside with Russian peacekeepers, and where we are already witnessing the disagreements over reading those articles, which my understanding were done in quite a hasty way, and therefore there's a certain quite high degree of uncertainty when interpreting those articles and putting them working in the practice. But what is also very important that the ceasefire agreement is silent over the status of Nagorno-Karabakh itself, which leads us to conclude that the deliberations over the possibly granting any status to Nagorno-Karabakh Oblast, starting with independence and ending up with autonomous status within Azerbaijan, within the Republic of Azerbaijan, has been put on the shelves And we should conclude that the parties have avoided with the purpose of discussing the status, and not just avoiding the issue of discussing the status, but my understanding that if at some point the issue of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh would be raised at all, that would be only about granting a sort of cultural autonomy to the oblast, something which has been already suggested by the President Aliyev, President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, but nothing more and nothing above the status of the cultural autonomy. But again, there are many uncharted waters, like I said, in that agreement, and we have yet to see down the road how various articles would be implemented, how they would be unfolding in the practice, and what would be real, tangible, and visible consequences or results of the agreement from the 10th of November. They entered to Nagorno-Karabakh, which is Azerbaijan proper, and definitely that provides Russia with a strong upper hand when exercising influence over the region and getting powerful leverages to meddle with internal politics and obstructing Georgia's course in terms of integrating with Euro-Atlantic community. But also it got quite a substantial say over Armenia's politics. It always had, in fact. But the reality at this point that when Armenia signed this ceasefire agreement, it became even more dependent on Russia's security shield. We saw substantial preeminence of Azeris in the conflict, and if not Russia's intervention at the very last moment, it would be very hard to imagine how deeper and how dire the consequences for Yerevan could be eventually. But in addition to Armenia, it's also worthwhile to note that Russians got an influence over Azerbaijan because they provided with tacit assistance or tacit silence of non-interference with Azeris offensive. And that's something probably which Baku, in a way, should be grateful for. Besides of those realities, the noteworthy factor that Turkey is back to the region after effectively 100 years of absence, and although that return is not reflected literally in hard power, but nevertheless, the Turkish factor over Azerbaijani's policy and region-wide, it became more substantial and more significant. The last point, if not the least, relates to the question where the West is. And that's probably something, which bothers us Georgians to a large extent. And I believe to suspect that some bromance, some type of bonds which have emerged or surfaced between Moscow and Ankara were driven primarily by the overlap in their interests to expel the West from the region to the largest extent possible. And that takes us, to the bigger question, to the situation not just in the Caucasus, but to the situation in the broader region of the Black Sea. And with appreciation of time limits of this interview, however, I should point out that this is a very sensitive issue. This is a very broad issue, and something which needs to be discussed more extensively, more meticulously, and more deliberately. Next issue which I would like to raise in this interview, if there is any problem between the conflicts in Nagorno Karabaj and Georgian conflicts in the Georgian, in the territory of Georgia, conflict in Abkhazia and in the so-called South Ossetia, which is Sama Chablo, Shida Kartli. I think that what unites all those conflicts at this moment is that essentially and fundamentally, each of those conflicts is a geopolitical conflict and not ethnic conflict. That is specifically true in case of Georgia. I'm always saying, and I never cease to repeat, that the so-called Georgia-Abkhazian conflict and the so-called Georgia-Ossetian conflicts are essentially the conflict or the conflicts between Georgia and Russia. And those conflicts being triggered up because of the clear objectives, foreign policy objectives of Georgia to join NATO, to join European Union, and that is the rationale behind kicking off those conflicts, but either by Abkhazians or by Ossetians, with the strong backup of Russia, with a strong military assistance, political assistance, informational assistance by Moscow. And at this stage, those provinces are effectively under the occupation. As you know, Russia recognized the so-called independence of Abkhazia and the so-called independence of Ossetia, but by Georgian law, and what is more important, by the international law, those territories are occupied territories, and that is something which is clearly spelled out by the international law, norms, and practices. So, what is our attitude? What is our policy? Two critical points which should be raised when speaking about, when trying to sum up the Georgian policy in relation to the occupation. Point number one, that we are pursuing very strongly a peaceful policy of reintegrating those territories, and reintegration definitely would not be possible without deoccupying Abkhazia and Sama Chablo. That's one point. And the second point, building a viable, proper, and prosperous democracy and economy in the rest of Georgia, and therefore making our case more attractive, more appealing for our Abkhazian and Ossetian nationals. There are various programs which are put in place by the government of Georgia, by Tbilisi. One of those are the steps to a better future. And that program provides for various measures and various initiatives, either in with regard to the medicine or medical assistance or education or any type of humanitarian help, or humanitarian engagement, which we could offer to our citizens and our nationals, be those of either of Caucasian region or Georgian region or Ossetian region, which are living under the occupation. So again, two very clear-cut features of Georgia's policy: the peaceful resolution, as I've said, and that peaceful resolution should and would happen only with active engagement of the international community, with active engagement of our international allies and partners, and reaching out to the population in the occupied provinces with as much help, with as much humanitarian help as we could offer and we could implement in the realities of the occupation. So those are two important milestones of Georgian policy when we speak about the occupation. To conclude this small interview, we believe and we are strongly pursuing Euro-Atlantic integration. We're strongly pursuing our civilizational choice, which is about joining the European community, the European polity, not just the economy-wise, but culture-wise, diplomacy-wise, and policy-making-wise. That's our choice. That's our civilizational choice. That's something, which is spelled out in the Georgian constitution, and what is very important, that those political objectives are based on the broad consensus of Georgian mainstream political parties and the Georgian population, and those are very strong fundamentals for irrevocability or irreversibility of that foreign policy course. I think that I did provide, or at least I managed to provide, with some feedback or food for thought on the region. Definitely it would be extremely hard and impossible to combine all the elements and all the key points within this brief interview, but I do thank you for your attention, and I very much hope that we'll meet again.
Gracias por acompañarnos una vez más. No será la única vez que acudamos a GEOCASE. Seguiremos consultándolos para conocer la perspectiva georgiana en las relaciones internacionales. Le agradecemos a su presidente, Viktor Kipiani, por su dedicación y la calidad analítica de sus comentarios, y será hasta otra ocasión.